Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for all of our guests. I think this is the biggest panel that we have had so far, so I'm very excited about that. Welcome to our Library Community Forum. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Paula Beswick, a Forum Committee member, and as always, I'm happy to be part of the Bozeman Public Library Civic Engagement Programming. Indeed, I decided to host this final forum from the library's large community room, which we're hoping, fingers crossed, we'll be back in here in September in person. So a quick thanks to the committee members, Ann Banks, Roger Breeding, C.D. Happel, Eva Patton, Dick Young, and our trustee reference librarian, Beth Boyson, who is sitting across from me. I actually get to wave to her and not via Zoom. We'll be busy this summer scheduling our September through December lineup, which is supported by the Bozeman Public Library Foundation. So look for that starting by the end of August. End of the summer, we'll get that information out about what we're doing in September. So our final spring forum will be a lively discussion about what happened in Helena during the legislative session. This has reminded me how relevant all of our virtual programs have been this season. We started last September with Betsy Gaines-Quammen, and she was discussing the threats to public land, particularly through the lens of conspiracy theories. She was followed by our illuminating panel on policing and keeping our community safe, which happened in October. We all remember what was going on back last summer and last fall, so that was particularly relevant. November found us discussing the science behind climate change's effects on wildfire, which of course was on the heels of the disastrous Bridger Foothills fire. December and January, respectively, were about politics with State Senator J.P. Pomnikowski and U.S. Senator John Tester. February, we talked about Native American issues as part of the One Book, One Bozeman program. In March, we were lucky to have coronavirus expert David Quammen. And then just last month, we talked about coexisting with wildlife in Montana. So we really covered the gamut, and I think you'll find that we will touch on many of these issues with our guests today from Montana Free Press. As a reminder to our attendees, you are muted without access to your camera, but we invite you to type your questions into the Q&A function at any time during the presentation. With a request of civility and respect, I will monitor these throughout the program and pose as many of your questions to our guests as time allows. Don't forget, we are being recorded by KGVM, so that will appear later on their website and their radio station, and this will be archived on the library's YouTube page. Today, we are joined by Brad Tyer, editor of Montana Free Press, along with his reporters who intrepidly covered this very unusual legislative session. Montana Free Press has been in existence. Oh, I forgot to double check this. I have 4 or 5 years. You can correct me on that, Brad. 5 years, there we go. And they are an independent nonprofit source of news based in Helena. Be sure to visit the website at montanafreepress.org. And if you are able, donate. It is a nonprofit news source, which many of them are turning to these days, like the Salt Lake City paper and other ones. So this might be the way of news. So if we can donate, we should. Before I turn it over to Brad, I want to give a quick introduction for each of the reporters, including Brad, with one interesting piece of information. I know journalists are loath to make the story about them and to toot their own horns, so I will do it, but I promise I will make it quick. Brad was the 2010 Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan and a 2011 Fund for Investigative Journalism grant recipient, which I thought was very cool. The following reporters also suggested book recommendations, which I will include. Be sure to check out the dedicated shelf at Country Bookshelf, where all of these books can be found. And Beth has them at the library here as well. So Eric Dietrich was the editor of MSU Exponent, the student newspaper there. And Eric, I met you way back when. I can't remember what I was doing, but I remember what you were doing. And he was the founder of Longstreet's Economic Reporting Project. His book recommendation is Fulfillment by Alex McGillis. Amanda Eggert is a graduate of the University of Montana School of Journalism, and she has written for Outside Magazine and Outlaw Partners. Her book recommendation is by Sebastian Younger, Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging. Alex Sackerson, had to ask how to say that, surprisingly easy. Alex Sackerson has spent the past decade writing long-form narrative stories that spotlight the people, the politics, and the wilds of Montana. And he has recommended Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science by Peter Hotez. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And Maura Silvers was a producer who produced Slate's daily news podcast, What Next? And her work has been featured on NPR as well as many other media outlets. The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. is her book recommendation. And now I will turn this whole shindig over to Brad. So thanks for joining us, Brad, Eric, Amanda, Alex, and Mara. We are thrilled to have you, and we are really eager to soak up all the knowledge that you have gained in Helena and thereabouts across Montana, so we can learn what happened in Helena. So Brad, I'll turn this over to you. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Paula. Those were good introductions. I appreciate it. We're gonna do a little bit more introduction before we get into the meat of things. First of all, I want to thank the Bozeman Public Library and the Library Foundation for hosting this event. We've done a couple of things like this over the past couple of weeks, sort of on our own platform through Montana Free Press. It's really exciting to be able to get out into the community and do it through this venue as well. So we appreciate the invitation. And those of you who are out there who I can't see, we appreciate you spending the lunch hour with us today. So I am editor of Montana Free Press. I've been here about 2 years. Montana Free Press is, our origin date is a little confusing, but effectively about 5 years ago is when we incorporated as a nonprofit. We're based here in Helena. We currently had one reporter on staff when I joined a little over a year and a half ago. We have been growing gangbusters and trying to keep up with the news since then. Now have 4 reporters that you see in front of you. We are a nonprofit site. We're donor supported with an assist from foundation grants here and there. So we do appreciate any kind of support you can show for the organization, which could be as simple as reading our work or signing up for our newsletter, or if you are in a position and inclined to help financially support the work we do. A little bit about our business model. We produce original content. We produce content in collaboration with other news organizations, notably recently Kaiser Health News, another nonprofit that's operating in Montana. We've done collaborative projects with Yellowstone Public Radio, with Montana Public Radio, with so collaboration and that kind of engagement is sort of core to our DNA. Everything that we publish is available for free on our website with no paywall, no advertising. Everything that we publish is also available for free republication by any other paper in the state. You might have recently seen part 1 of Amanda's story on the certain conflicts in the Crazy Mountains, was published in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle on Sunday, I think. Also had a piece on the new marijuana law from Justin Franz, who's a freelancer with us, that the Daily Chronicle picked up as well. So you might see our byline out there in other places aside from on our site. But wherever you see it, we appreciate it. I'm going to do a slightly more thorough introduction for the reporters here. I'm going to go around my screen and start with Mara Silvers, who is based here in Helena and who started with us almost a year ago today. You want to introduce yourself and your areas of expertise and interest?
Yeah,
Mara?
hi. So came to Montana Free Press after a while working out of the state, but I grew up in Helena, glad to be back. Learned a lot covering the legislative session this year, as is probably to be expected. Some of the things that I ended up focusing a lot on, I went into the session thinking I was going to be looking mostly at social services, Medicaid, some criminal legal reform issues. Ended up doing a lot of focus on bills that would affect LGBTQ people and a lot of abortion restrictions that ended up getting passed, as well as, some of those judicial conflicts that popped up. So a lot unexpected, and learned a lot in the process.
Yeah, who knew there were going to be things that we didn't anticipate coming down the pike? I'm going to kick it over to Alex. Alex, I've worked with for years and years. Let's not count how many years. We're both alums of the Missoula Independent. And Alex started working with us January 1st. So we threw him right into the meat of it with a new beat and a new job. Alex is based in Missoula. Tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your areas of interest.
Yeah. So came out North Dakota native, but with family roots here in Montana. Came out to Missoula to get a degree in journalism from the University of Montana, and then put in about almost 10 years at the Independent, covering a lot of state and federal politics, environmental issues. Freelanced for a couple of years, and then Brad convinced me to jump on Free Press full time, and covering education primarily, but during the legislature also covered a lot of voting rights issues, a lot of sort of detailed healthcare stuff, kind of a grab bag of things. So yeah.
Absolutely. And Eric Dietrich is next. Eric Dietrich is the only reporter here who's been here longer than I have. So he's the veteran in the room and has some Bozeman connections. And you want to describe what you do?
Yeah, so yep. So I've been at Free Press 2.5 years now, and among other things, before that, I spent a stint covering City Hall, the Chronicle in Bozeman. Know that town. Went to MSU too. I'm our data geek in the newsroom, so I spent a lot of time this legislative session sitting in the basement of the Capitol, looking at process data, trying to understand how things are moving through the system, kind of from a data perspective. I run our Capitol Tracker web guide, if you're familiar with that. I also did some reported coverage, did a lot of kind of following the money, looking at tax policy, budget policy, trying to understand what we're doing with our $2 billion in stimulus money that's coming into the state through the latest round of COVID stimulus. And then also did a little bit of land use coverage and housing stuff, trying to understand what is the legislature doing about this thing that's a major cost of living concern. Yeah, and I grab bag other stuff too, but we'll get to that if people ask questions.
Right. Yeah, I'll loop back to you later with a question on how you've solved the housing crisis in Bozeman. So I hope you're ready for that. Yeah, if you've seen one of our articles that has a data visualization on it that made you kind of stop and scratch your head and go, holy moly, how did they do that? Only Eric knows.
Or what is that supposed to communicate?
And then another one of our latest hires, also hired like Alex on January 1st and thrown headfirst into the session to cover the environmental beat. And well, as you can tell, all of us, or all of them, covering their core beats and a lot of adjacent beats. Amanda Eggert, who lives and is based in Bozeman. So hometown reporter there. You want to introduce yourself, Amanda?
Yeah, I freelanced for Montana Free Press for a couple of years before being brought on full time in January. I report on climate change, energy policy, natural resource issues, public land, wildlife, call all things in that general area.
Great. And I think I should mention as a little pat on our back, I believe we have the only sort of full-time dedicated education beat and environmental beat reporters in the state, in Alex and Amanda. And so when the support for the organization is high, that's the kind of things we're doing with the money. Is looking for undercovered areas that need really focused attention and developed expertise, and trying to provide that. So we're super excited to have our two most recent hires on, well, all of you. So that should give those of you who are watching a little bit of a roadmap, kind of questions that you might want to address to these individual reporters later as we go. And right now I'm going to jump right into some of the meat of it, and I'm going to start with Alex because we have some recent news. In fact, we've got a story in the can. We'll be able to publish it until this event is over, about the Board of Regents reaction to the constitutional carry law. So we've got a fresh story just waiting to publish. That's super current. I imagine that's of interest in a college-oriented community like Bozeman. So what's the latest, Alex?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So the regents actually met this morning virtually, the Montana Board of Regents who oversee the Montana University system, and voted unanimously after a robust discussion to pursue litigation over House Bill 102, which is the so-called constitutional carry law, which expanded expanded concealed carry across the state, including on college campuses. And the regents' primary question that they're hoping to get a court to answer is whether their constitutional authority over the university system under the state constitution was encroached upon by the legislature in passing this law. It's going to be a very interesting series of events or thing to watch unfold, but that's kind of where we're at. I spoke this morning with the bill's sponsor, Representative Seth Bergley, a Republican out of Joliet, who was disappointed to hear that the regents are going to litigate, but he has a different read on the constitutional questions involved here, namely that House Bill 102 upholds people's Second Amendment rights under the federal constitution and state constitution. And that kind of gets into sort of some constitutional butting of heads. So yeah, and it's also worth noting too, and Eric would probably give me crap if I didn't mention this, that there was a specific provision, an allocation of $1 million to help the university system implement this law on the condition that the regents did not pursue litigation. And according to Bergley this morning, that money's now off the table. So that's another impact of this litigation. So
Oh, that money's entirely off the table. It's not lessened. It's just off. Okay, interesting.
Either or.
Okay. Since we're talking about laws that are going to be challenged or have been challenged, I think that actually might be a pivot to another Alex topic area, because we also know some recent lawsuits filed. In fact, you had a story on this yesterday. I will get to the rest of you. Sorry, this is a little top-loaded on Alex on the front end. Talk about what's going on with changes to Montana's voting laws and the lawsuits that are currently live addressing those.
Yeah, so the legislature really, there were quite a few changes to election laws passed this session. A couple of the major ones were the elimination of same-day voter registration, which was passed as a ballot initiative or a ballot measure in 2004. And then a lot of restrictions around the types of photo identification that are required for voters to vote at the polls. There was also a bill that's just now been challenged within the last week that makes it establishes penalties for anyone who is paid to collect ballots for delivery. All three of those bills are now being challenged legally by both the Montana Democratic Party and in a separate lawsuit, the ACLU of Montana, Western Native Voice, and a couple of other Native American entities. So the arguments there are that those laws are going to disproportionately disenfranchise rural voters and voters on Native American reservations in the state who face a lot of hurdles in getting to the polls or in accessing mail-in balloting. So that's kind of where that's all at. And the Montana Democratic Party had just amended its initial complaint because it sued over the same-day voter registration and voter ID laws earlier when those were signed, but amended their complaint last Friday when the ballot collection law was passed. So that's also included in their suit.
Right. Speaking of laws that came out of the legislature that either are being challenged or are likely to be challenged, one of the things that we probably didn't anticipate coming in early into the session is the legislature's, how to characterize this, allegations of bias in the judicial system and the current conflict going on between the legislature and the judicial system, the Montana Supreme Court. That's probably a good pivot to Mara, who's been doing most of our coverage, although Eric certainly pitched in on that. What's the latest that you can tell us about the status of that? Somebody said headbutt earlier. I think that can be reapplied here.
Yeah, I'll try to do my best. It's a really complicated topic. So there are two lawsuits that are pending before the Supreme Court right now. One that is stemming from a change in law that basically changes how judges who fill vacancies at the district court level or Supreme Court level get appointed. So for the last several decades, there's been an independent commission that's been involved with that. Pretty heavy on representation from the judicial branch and vetting those candidates, a lot of public transparency, public process. So this bill that's now being challenged gives the governor direct ability to appoint vacancies, judicial vacancies. Those appointees still need to be confirmed by the Senate. So shortly after that bill got signed into law, it was challenged in court, and that case is pending. Related, but not the same, there's also another lawsuit that came out of that first lawsuit, basically about legislative subpoena powers, the extent of the legislature's ability to subpoena documents from other branches of government. The legislature issued subpoenas to to the court administrator for the Supreme Court, as well as all 7 members of the Supreme Court, as part of a broader allegation of misconduct and bias in the judicial branch. There were a lot of emails that were released. They were then kind of that release was quashed. The legal back and forth is ongoing, but basically the latest with that is that the legislature, which is represented by the Attorney General's office, they filed a motion to say that all 7 Supreme Court justices should not be allowed to adjudicate that case, the second case about legislative subpoenas, because they themselves had been subpoenaed, and so the court administrator had been subpoenaed, so there was a conflict of interest, is what the Attorney General's office was saying. And just last week, time is kind of mushy for me, but I think just last week, the Supreme Court rejected that motion and said, essentially, if we are disqualified because we're part of the judicial branch, then there's no way for this case to proceed, because all judges would be at risk of being considered unqualified for this case. So that's proceeding with the full court, and it will be a very interesting battle to kind of continue to watch, just because it's one of the first times that the legislature and a separate branch of government are really battling it out in court. I mean, more so than an executive office, the executive office and the legislature, I think in past settings. So I guess a lot of that's just still up in the air.
So we're not done. We've got plenty of reporting yet to do for the next couple of weeks and months and probably years on that one. I'm going to bounce to a different topic, down to Amanda in Bozeman. Well, let me just frame this as open-endedly as possible. How did wildlife generally come out of this session, Amanda?
It was really interesting for wildlife this session. I think there was a lot of proposals. There were a lot of proposals oriented around really aggressive predator management, grizzly bears and wolves in particular. And I think what's interesting about that, especially with the wolf proposals, is similar legislation had been proposed, say in like 2015, and didn't pass, didn't have the Republican support. And some of the representatives and senators that didn't vote for measures sponsored by, say, Bob Brown in previous sessions did this time. So I think there was really a very active, I don't want to say explosive, but a pretty tense situation around predator management this session, where there was a lot of public interest and lawmakers really clearly came down on one side or the other, I would say. I think it was also interesting for bison management. The tribes in the state were pretty discouraged to see efforts to restrict wild bison, both in terms of how the state defines them and how they move about in the state, from, say, Yellowstone Park to other tribes. So that was another big issue, I would say. And then finally, on the hunting front, non-resident hunters have a little different picture in terms of drawing tags this in future hunting seasons than they have in the past. I think those that go with outfitters have a little bit better chance of drawing tags now. So that also is a pretty interesting issue to track through the session.
And that bill on the tags, that was presented as a pandemic response. Is that right?
Right.
Basically
Yeah.
trying to help the outfitters get back on their feet after a really rough season.
Yeah, it had a few different provisions, but there was one specifically that allowed non-resident hunters who had booked a hunt last season and weren't able to go on that hunt because of the pandemic, the opportunity to buy a tag for this season if they go with an outfitter. That was that was presented as a response to COVID to keep some small businesses afloat.
Okay. And there was another bill that you were tracking, Amanda. Was it House Bill 278, which would have impacted the way that nonprofits do business? And I believe Bozeman is pretty much a hotbed of the nonprofit world. That should be of special local interest, I think. How did that pan out?
Right. I think some people were kind of surprised to find that Governor Gianforte actually vetoed that bill. It passed. It passed with, I think, some comfort, I would say. It wasn't a super close vote in the legislature.
And the bill would have done
right.
What?
It would have directed the Attorney General to collect member rolls for a nonprofit that challenges or supports a government action. And it also would have kind of changed how legal fees collected in response to challenging a regulatory action are classified for taxation purposes.
Right. Well, and according to the nonprofits, what was the gist of what the bill would do? What was it aimed at?
I spoke with someone from the ACLU's Montana chapter who said he saw the bill as an effort to just have a chilling effect on challenges to regulatory actions. The idea that the AG would know who's contributing to various nonprofits would decrease participation among nonprofits who are working in various environmental, social services, different spaces like that.
Right. And that was one of 11, I think mostly, if not all, Republican bills that the governor vetoed on late Friday afternoon. Is that right?
Alex probably knows that one best. I can't remember what the exact count was. There was a bunch.
Yeah, it was 11, and those were announced late Friday afternoon. They could have been vetoed Thursday or Friday, but yeah, it was 11.
Right, great. Let's talk about money. Eric, you want to walk us through what we learned from the budget process and how stimulus money did or did not throw everything kind of cattywampus in those negotiations?
Oh my gosh, how to get this to a 30-second answer.
Oh, you got minutes.
You don't want me talking for minutes about the budget. One of the big things that the legislature does every time it meets every other year is write the state 2-year budget. So about $12 billion in spending. It's money from property taxes, income taxes, all the money we send to Helena and get back in the form of services. So they have to figure out how to set that up every year. And that's just something that happens. Usually it kind of flies beneath the radar unless particular aspects of it become controversial or kind of end up being heavily debated. Everybody going into the session was worried that we were going to have kind of a tight fiscal crunch because COVID has wrecked portions of the economy. But the reality is that it wasn't a very tight session. There was plenty of money coming around. because they expect a pretty sharp rebound at this point. So the economy is going to rebound, more money to income taxes. That means there's more money for the state to spend on stuff because income taxes are the biggest source of funding. And then on top of that, the Democratic controlled Congress in DC passed the huge ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act stimulus bill that directs another $2 billion into Montana. And other states were going to be needing to use some of that money to backfill their budgets, but because our budget was in pretty good shape, suddenly we have $2 billion to spend on stuff, on one-time money. And so lawmakers are trying to figure out what to do with big chunks of that. Some of it, the feds have already said you got to use 100 million of it for childcare, but a lot of it's flexible. So we're going to have a lot of money going into infrastructure projects, water and sewer projects specifically, also broadband connectivity in different parts of the state. And so I was trying to watch how that's going to be set up and lay the groundwork to watch how that money is actually spent over the next couple of years, because it's a huge sum of money. It's like, $2,000 per Montanan or something like that. Like just a ridiculous amount of money coming in that could dramatically transform the state's business landscape or connectivity landscape with broadband, or it could be the biggest boondoggle in state history. Stay tuned.
Well, and I think one of the interesting points there is that the legislature doesn't want to use that money to establish new ongoing programs that they will have to keep finding ways to fund in perpetuity, or at least long term.
Right.
So
Yeah.
they're looking for one shot stimulus money where
Right.
they can put this and not have to continue the program, right?
Right. So infrastructure types investments were pretty attractive that way. And then, and that kind of came up against the fundamental pressure at the legislature. The minority Democrats wanted to see more state investment in social services, which by definition is an ongoing expense. Like you set up state-funded preschool programs. You got to pay those preschool teachers their salary over time and commit to doing that for the long run. Whereas the Republicans were wanting to limit state spending, reduce taxes a little bit, which they did. Try to kind of tighten the belt instead of commit themselves to that sort of long-term spending effort.
Right. I'm going to stick with you a minute a minute, Eric. Governor came into office, certainly campaigned for office with an economic message, with a jobs growth message, and I think most of that landed in terms of tax policy this session. You want to talk about what happened in terms of jobs or in terms of tax policy revisions?
Right. Yeah. So I'll start with the caveat that any elected Democrats in the audience are going to groan at the way I say this, because the Democrats have been criticized. They have been arguing that the Republicans didn't do enough for jobs. Now we haven't had a real jobs bill. Whereas the Republican approach here, like Brad mentioned, has really been focused on tax policy and tax incentives. They cut a number of taxes with the stated aim of making the state an easier place to do business, making it easier and more attractive for people maybe coming from out of state to come here, people with money to come here and spend that money on building businesses in the state, creating jobs, growing the economy. And it's explicitly a trickle-down theory of change, right? Like if they argue if that happens, that middle-class Montanans then will have more access to jobs and have an easier time like living the lives they want to live in the state. And so we saw cuts to the business equipment tax. We saw minor cuts to the income tax for higher earners, with more coming down the road. A couple other minor things, like there's some incentives programs and designed to encourage people to come start tech companies in Montana, that sort of thing. And what remains to be seen whether that will end up being a successful economic policy. The Democrats, of course, have argued it's not the right way to go, and would much rather have seen tax relief focused on lower and middle income Montanans, arguing that putting money into people's pockets there will boost up the economy as people go out and buy groceries and stuff.
So we have a pretty classic partisan divide just in terms of strategy, and watch that play out.
Yeah, right. It's very similar to what we've seen Republicans, Democrats saying for decades on those issues.
Right. And I assume we will be around to track the impacts of those policies over the next couple of years and see what works and what didn't. We would be remiss. We probably have about 10 minutes left in this portion of the program, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't have some discussion of some of the most contentious and controversial packages of bills that came through this session. One of them regards abortion rights, which, like a couple of other things we've talked about, has been on the legislative wish list for years, but has always run into a Democratic governor's veto. This year, I think the essential core dynamic of this session that was unique is that Democratic veto was not there. We had unified control through all the branches. 2 branches. I'm not gonna put the judicial branch into that. Mara tracked those bills for us through the session. Well, and I don't know if this is a logical bundle, but also the transgender restriction bills, which was a mixed bag when it came out. You want to talk about those a little bit, and then I'm going to bump to Alex and talk about vaccines.
Sure. Yeah. So the abortion restriction bills came in a couple different forms. There were 3 of them mainly that will be, I guess, that are on the horizon, so to speak. One of them is basically a pretty wide-ranging restriction on late-term abortions that happen after 20 weeks of pregnancy. There's a couple exceptions in those cases, but that bill has been signed into law, makes it very, very difficult for anybody to get an abortion after 20 weeks, which already, just to be said, the number of people who get abortions after 20 weeks is very small and are usually in pretty dire situations. And then there's another bill that would restrict telemed access to early term medical abortions that are sometimes can, let me see how to say this. There was a provision briefly during COVID where those medications could be mailed to people because they wouldn't be able to travel because of the pandemic. This bill puts restrictions on that. Also adds a lot of other restrictions for providers and data collection requirements for patients who are trying to get those early term medical abortions up to 10 weeks during their pregnancy. And then there's another bill that would require providers to offer an ultrasound to a patient to view their ultrasound before they have an abortion. So all of those have been signed into law, and if they are, depending on what happens in the courts, they would be effective on October 1st of this year. None of those laws have been challenged so far, but the lawsuits are highly likely, to say the least. There's another ballot initiative that I won't dive into right now, but that would be before voters in the next election cycle in 2022. And then on the other social issue front, a much more, like Brad said, mixed bag in terms of what actually passed, but there were a couple bills that specifically would have affected transgender minors, and one that would affect transgender, well, actually 2 that would affect transgender adults. One of those was an effort to restrict gender in 2 different forms and failed to pass both times. House Bill 113 and House Bill 427, in case anybody was following those. One bill that did pass as it did as a version did in several other states was the restriction on young transgender people who want to play sports. That bill has been passed and was very quietly signed into law by the governor a couple of weeks ago. No bill signing ceremony, no announcement, just a very quiet kind of under the radar signature. I think trying to avoid some of the press that Republican governors in other states have received after they've acted on those bills. I would be very surprised if that wasn't challenged in court. And then there are another couple of bills that one of which might also see legal challenges that could have some conflicts with local non-discrimination ordinances, as Bozeman has, Missoula has, Helena has. And then another bill that restricts the way that somebody can change the gender that's listed on their birth certificate as whatever age they are, makes it quite a bit harder to do that. And that one's also expected to be challenged in court.
So if we have any lawyers listening, congratulations. You're not going to be out of work anytime soon. Alex, another thing that played out in the legislature, and this is probably going to be the last question for this part anyway, is COVID-19 vaccine requirements, bans on vaccine requirements. What happened? What do we need to know?
Yeah, so I'll boil this down as quickly as I can.
It's a lot, I know.
Yeah, it's important to note that halfway through the session, this issue appeared to have been killed by lawmakers based on a vote on a previous bill. But so two pieces of legislation actually passed this session. The first, extremely high profile, House Bill 702, establishes a prohibition on private businesses and government agencies requiring proof of vaccination or requiring vaccination as a condition of receiving goods, services, educational opportunities, employment. There were some amendments that the governor passed back to the legislature in response to concerns from hospitals.
That question got really pointed around hospitals specifically.
Yep, because that hospitals were really concerned about the impacts on patient safety and health. And so the governor allowed hospitals to at least ask employees to volunteer their vaccination status and then adopt some additional policies if there are unvaccinated staff regarding designed to limit spread. Another bill, House Bill 334, revised the medical exemption laws for vaccination in the state and made it a little bit easier for folks to get a medical exemption for vaccination. They can now get it from nurse practitioners and some other medical professionals beyond just a physician. But I think what's really important to note in this context is that a previous version of 702 died halfway through the session on a deadlocked vote in the House. And during the second half of the session, we saw a concerted push to get more folks vaccinated against COVID-19 in the state. And I think a lot of the groundswell of support for House Bill 702 was sort of a perfect storm where folks may not be entirely against vaccination in general for religious or personal reasons, but are nervous, hesitant, or have a lot of unanswered questions about the COVID-19 vaccine, which resulted in them feeling that pressuring or requiring individuals to be vaccinated against this particular virus, given, that this vaccine only has an emergency declaration, it hasn't been fully approved by the FDA, that those requirements put people in a really dangerous and potentially dangerous situation. And I talked to Representative Jennifer Carlson about this. She was the sponsor of both the bills, and she agreed that the timing of this, the fact that the pandemic had raised vaccination to such a high profile debate in the state, really factored into the resurgence of the bill and its passage into law. And she was very clear that the work done by her and the governor's office to address the hospital's concerns, she was very clear that was important to reflect the spirit of her bill, that this is, among supporters, this has been pitched as a personal freedom issue, that you shouldn't be discriminated against based on your own personal beliefs on vaccination. Of course, a lot of what we're hearing now from community health workers is public health depends on vaccination, on widespread vaccination. And that is it's not just an individual protection, it's protecting the entire community. And so we really have these two arguments that are fundamentally opposed, and they just got shot to the forefront of everybody's mind by this COVID-19 pandemic. So.
Right. Just really, really turbocharged an issue that's been hanging around for a while.
Hopefully that was thorough enough.
Well, we got plenty of time for follow-up questions. I'm going to flag Paula that I'm kind of wrapping up this portion here, so we'll jump in with Q&As in a minute. But to lead into that, I just want to mention that you can probably tell there was a lot to cover this session. And in the past 45 minutes, we've really only talked about sort of the tip of the iceberg. probably the most interesting bills, but tons of other bills passed. But even so, Amanda has done work on questions about Northwestern, questions about Colstrip. Eric has done some work on kind of affordable housing questions and how they did or did not get addressed. Alex spent a lot of time covering a raft of education bills. Pretty big collection of pretty impactful bills about how public education is going to work in the state going forward. We probably missed some of Mara's beat as well. So those are some areas that are ripe for follow-up questions if anybody has any, or of course, anything else. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paula to steer some audience questions to us.
Great. Wow. Thank you. My head is spinning.
There will be a quiz.
Right. Which is why I had my camera off. You don't need to see the exorcist happening here. So we do have questions. And again, I will encourage everybody in the audience to go ahead and put your questions in, and I will start throwing those out. But I do want to start by saying JP Pomnikowski, who is our state legislator, in response to the initial question about the lawsuit with the dollars amount, she says the 1 million to the Montana University system was appropriated only if the legislation wasn't challenged, not even won, by the Board of Regents. So that's coming straight from our esteemed legislator's mouth. So before I jump into audience questions, Brad, you and I talked about this a little bit, but I want to talk about, and it might sound boring to some people, but I do want to talk about some process. Eric, I know you spent a whole lot of time in the basement in the Capitol, and is that where you would normally be? I would like to hear from each one of the reporters about how did this session go? And this really is stemming from when we had JP Pomnikowski in December prior to the session starting. And she was trying to sort of predict or foresee what was going to be happening, particularly around COVID and COVID protocols and how that was all going to shake out. So Eric, maybe we can start with you and then just go around, and you guys and gals can all just give your impressions as journalists.
And Eric, I want to make sure you include my favorite stat of the session.
Oh, the how much was spent on Zoom stuff?
Yeah, I don't know why I love that so much.
Yeah. So the answer there before I forget about it is the legislature spent about $1 million getting the building ready for remote participation, both lawmakers able to vote remotely, so people that weren't comfortable being in the building for health reasons or COVID protection reasons could still participate. Also letting the public weigh in remotely. So like we had people testifying via Zoom, which is not something we've had before, which is a major sea change for public access to bill hearings. But as for me, if everybody doesn't know, the press offices are in the basement of the Capitol without windows, which is why we all joke about it. And that's just where we work and write stories during the session. But this is my second session covering the Montana Capitol. So in 2019, I was up in hearing rooms with lawmakers on the House floor more, kind of physically present where the discussions are happening more consistently. Whereas this session, in part because I was worried about COVID stuff, I was more often in the basement, even though I was in the building, in the basement, watching stuff happen via the TV screens. Just because those hearing rooms are tight. And I think probably most everyone's heard about this, but masking and other COVID precautions became political in the Capitol because you have like kind of the ranges in risk tolerance in Montana's culture generally between places like Bozeman and places like Miles City, for example, and then that getting tied into the vein of political debate we've had nationally over how necessary are masks, how serious is the virus, how worried about this do we need to be, how cautious do we need to be about it. Like that stuff came out in spades in the Capitol, probably for the worse. And so that just became another dynamic in an already highly political space. Yeah, well, it's probably enough of me talking for a second. So,
I'll kick that, if that's okay, Paula. I'll kick that same question over to Amanda, who I know I did a lot of reporting pre-session on how access would be working for the public, for legislators, for reporters, for that matter.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would say for the public, it was a little bit of a net win to be able to testify remotely, especially for communities where you might have people, where Helena is a much further drive. So that was pretty neat, I think. And also for members of the public to be able to watch video of all of the committee hearings. In the past, there's been audio, but not video. So I think in many ways, the public benefited from some of this infrastructure, and it'll be interesting to see if it continues into future sessions. So that was great. From my perspective, as somebody based in Bozeman, I appreciated that if two hearings were happening at the same time, that I could watch one as it was happening live and then go back and look at another recording later. So that was kind of helpful. But also, I think I've spoken with lobbyists who found that it was a little bit harder to connect with lawmakers and make a point, catch them between meetings or out in the hallway somewhere in the Capitol. So I think that was another dynamic that was interesting to watch through the session.
It's worth noting that a lot of lawmakers are participating remotely, especially people on the Democratic side of the aisle. So sometimes people weren't even in the building, consistently. I think that started to change. I think more people were in the building the second half of the session as the vaccine became available. But especially early on, there were a lot of people absent.
Mara, you want to take a swing at this one too?
Yeah, I mean, it was my first legislative session working as a reporter, and I felt like it was a bit of a, it just kind of was a, what am I trying to say? It just was very inconsistent who you were going to be able to connect with and not connect with. I was mostly remote, even though I was in Helena, didn't feel comfortable going up to the Capitol. And so sometimes I could catch lawmakers in an email, call them in between floor sessions, text them. Sometimes they'd get back to me right away, other times not so much. So kind of just depended on the time and on the person. I will say sometimes it was nice that if I was playing phone tag with somebody all day, maybe they'd call me back when they were actually leaving the building for the day, and I'd get a fuller kind of debrief and a big picture look at all of the little in-between things that had happened that day. So in some ways that was kind of nice, but yeah, a challenge, and also much easier than I'm sure past sessions would have been to cover remotely because of all of the remote access.
Alex, what was your experience of it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering, certain legislative issues since 2011, off and on, not covering the session itself, but diving in when there's a bill pertinent to something I'm covering. So it was a little familiar for me to be covering it remotely from Missoula, but it definitely seemed a lot smoother this session, probably due to some of those changes that Eric's talking about. And I a lot of texting and emailing and phone calls to lawmakers and lobbyists, trying to get folks on the phone. So there was a lot more phone time this session. For the most part, didn't have a whole lot of trouble getting in touch with folks. And when I did, it was typically on issues that I wasn't confident that I was going to be, getting everybody to return calls or text messages. So just kind of, yeah, shook out kind of the same way that past sessions have, just with a little weird flavor of pandemic, especially when I was there the 1 week in person. So
basically, I think I think COVID-19 probably did to session coverage the same thing it did to everybody over the past year, which is just blow up Zoom into their worlds and their work. People talk about the losses from a partly remote session, which is, people like to talk about the nuances and the details and the dynamics that you observe by being in the hallways and rubbing elbows with the lobbyists and with the legislators. And doubtless some of that was lost for lawmakers and lobbyists and journalists. But there was I think there was a flip upside as well. The press generally had a bigger presence in this session between Montana Free Press, between the newspapers, between public radio, between individual newspapers and Daily Montanan as well. So there were a lot of dedicated Capitol reporters in this session, more so than any recent session. And for all those folks to be able to cover it from anywhere they were, I don't know if I would guess at sort of a net positive or net negative in terms of how well the session got covered under these circumstances. But I think it got covered pretty well. And I'll give it back to Paula for the next question. Hope we didn't take up too much time with that one.
No, it was very interesting. First, to know that the vaccination has a flavor to it, and and you know, Brad, your comment on how other papers were actually able to cover it better across the state of Montana. That was one of the questions I had, was, you know, how are things happening across the state? Because I just, you know, have my slice here in Gallatin County, so that's interesting to know. So we do have some questions coming in, and I want to get to our audience ones. It says, somebody says, it seems that in this legislative session, a large number of bills were introduced at the last minute, with the result that there was very little opportunity for vetting by other legislators or for input from the public. Is my perception correct? If so, was this process different from previous sessions? And Brad, I'll let you decide who to take this, or Eric, if you want to pop in there.
Y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's in Eric's wheelhouse.
Yeah, I wrote about this and dragged Mara and Alex into it at various points, and Amanda too into it at various points. But yeah, so there were, I think to start off with, like, last minute bills are a dynamic that happens at the Capitol every session. That's just part of the way the process works. Like, lawmakers tend to be deadline driven. And there are things that, you know, people won't compromise on until the last minute, and then those compromises happen and things move through kind of fast sometimes. The lawmakers that are in the middle of those details will kind of shrug and say, "Oh, that's just the way the sausage is made," right? The people that feel left out in the cold as those bargains are struck, like, oftentimes feel like that wasn't a very good public process. And I think it's an open question how good it is in terms of governance. But there's a time-honored tradition in the Capitol of doing that. And some of that happened, it might have happened more this session, in part because, like, in past, the last decade and a half, there's been a Democratic governor as a check on the Republican majority legislature. So you have more intra-party political dynamics. Whereas I think this session, there was probably more trust by the legislature that the governor would sign the bills that they passed along to him. And so I think there was maybe a little bit more last minute stuff. I didn't have a chance to stop and count, but we did do a story where we tabulated 4 or 5 significant last minute things that got added. There are kind of this procedural shenanigan type things. Anyone else want to add on that? Clarify my.
Seeing none, I'm going to move on. Thanks, Eric. So I think this one's going to be for Amanda, but per Brad, what happened with the Northwestern Energy coal strip bill? The one that it was said would guarantee Northwest Energy profits and settle the consumer with long-term expenses.
Yeah, I think that's a reference to Senator C. Fitzpatrick bill. And that passed through the Senate with pretty comfortable margins, and then it got stalled in the House Energy Committee. That was actually one of the last bills that they acted on. And I think it was something like 11-1, they voted to table that. So I think lawmakers got a whole lot of public input on that bill, and they decided to go a different direction with it and table it. But then there were also parts of it that were revived in a bill pertaining to how water utility disputes are adjudicated. And that that was one of those late process bills that there was a provision that got added to a pretty unrelated bill late in the process. And that never actually got second reading before the full House. I believe it was the House. It might have been the Senate, but I think it was the House. And so it just kind of died in process as well.
Thanks. So this next question, I'm going to go ahead and ask it, but it's more of a policy kind of question, but maybe from the reporting, somebody can have a better understanding of this. That's my preface. Does anyone have any idea what independent contractors, self-employed people, can do to keep up the pandemic employment benefit? The governor has cut off the benefit in June, and this person has written Tester and President Biden, but so far no avail. So is there anything that somebody has learned about this that could be passed along?
So I'm not going to be, I've written about this issue. I'm not going to be any help in terms of how can you effectively lobby to get a different policy outcome, right? Like it's up to the governor. You know, we elected last year, and we'll have a chance to, voters will have a chance to decide whether to keep him, I presume, if he runs for a re-election in 2023. Is it 2023? No, okay, 2024. Okay. 4-year terms, not 3-year terms, Eric. But anyway, yeah. So there's the debate there, right? So for anyone who's not familiar, one of the things that happened in terms of federal assistance during the pandemic is that under the initial CARES Act, the feds put a bunch of money into the UI system to make it to expand unemployment benefits for people who weren't able to work because of the pandemic. And for the first time, you know, traditionally that's been a wage employee only system where employers pay into the state unemployment insurance trust fund, and if they lay people off, that trust fund helps those people cover their living expenses while they look for new work. And one of the things that was changed about that during the pandemic under the Bullock administration last year was expanding those benefits to people who are independent contractors, 1099 employees, freelancers that haven't paid into that system historically, but weren't able to work during the pandemic just like everybody else. And there are a couple other things too that if you heard about, like the $600 a week expanded unemployment benefits for people that are on UI during the pandemic, that was kind of lumped in that same effort there. It was, I think, most recently $300 a week. But anyway, as we come out of the pandemic, the Montana economy seems to be doing better. We're hearing a lot from employers that are frustrated because they can't find people to work, particularly in like food service, public-facing jobs. Those employers are passing those frustrations on to the governor, who has felt the need to do something, and he's decided to do something by ending Montana's participation in those federal programs as of June, in an effort to, that the Republicans are afraid that those UI benefits are making it so people that could be working are deciding not to. So they're trying to, they say, rejigger the incentives to make it easier for employers to find the workers they need. So there's an open policy question there about whether that, and a values question there about whether that's the appropriate way to do it. But, short of lobbying the governor, like he's pretty clearly has the power to make that decision. So.
Wow, thank you for that, for the very complete response, Eric. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
I don't have you guys can decide who wants to answer this, or if all of you do, or Brad, you can throw it out. But someone says you have to be really nimble to keep up with what's happening. For example, this morning's article on what was being signed and what was vetoed. So did you come across any surprises along the way as a reporter covering an issue?
That's a great question for anybody but me. Who wants to volunteer to start? Especially any of our 3 reporters who were really covering the session in a focused manner for the first time this year.
Yeah, I can hop in. I would say that the resurrection of the vaccine issue or vaccine requirements was one that kind of House Bill 702 came up in the latter half of the session, and like I said earlier, I'd kind of seen that as having been, died on a deadlocked vote before transmittal. So that one kind of came up out of nowhere for sure. Not sure if anybody else has any surprises.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I kept asking people all session who were following the same bills that I was reporting on, what was gonna happen next, or what they thought the next installment would be. And everyone would, maybe they'd have a couple ideas of what the next twist or turn would be, but so many people said nothing's over until sine die. And that's that's when the legislature gavels out. And it really just came back to that of saying, most of the time, anything could happen at any point. in terms of whether or not a policy lives, dies, changes, gets radically amended, the amendments get quashed. Like it's just an open question. So for some of the bills I was following, it kind of felt like there were things that they wouldn't move for months and months, maybe not months and months and months, but like maybe a month and a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden things would happen all at once. So there was a bill about pretty dramatically changing the way that people have their eligibility checked when they apply for for public assistance programs like Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families, and SNAP. And that policy first got introduced maybe like middle of January, and then it had like huge pushback. People ended up, having some pretty heavy opposition. It was radically revised, but then it didn't move for, I think, like a month and a half, maybe 2 months. Like nothing happened on the surface at all. So that was just one of the examples that I was constantly surprised by the random pace of things and how you do have to be on your toes to keep up with the latest twists and turns.
I'll say I was a little bit surprised to see Governor Gianforte veto Senate Bill 278. I'd heard from sources that he was getting pressure from kind of across the political spectrum from various nonprofits to veto that measure, but I was a little bit surprised to see it. I think that was kind of a fascinating development that happened late last week. Oh, and yeah, that was the nonprofit investigation piece of legislation.
Thanks for clarifying. I was going to ask, but when you said last week, I figured out, but yes, thanks for that. Okay, we have, oh, Brad, did you have something?
Nothing critical.
Everything's critical now, it seems. So this is a question for Eric, and it's not a completely thought out question, but the zoning inclusion issue was very big for Gallatin County, and I know our city commissioner, Terry Cunningham, testified. Can you explain what happened and where we are at with that?
Yeah, so for anybody who isn't familiar, inclusionary zoning is an affordable housing policy where in the way it works is it's usually adopted by like local governments, like the two that have had it in Montana are the city of Bozeman and the city of Whitefish. And they say, hey, if you want to build a new housing development in our town, you've got to set aside, say, 10% of the units in that development and sell them at price targets so that we have at least some affordable housing coming in order to meet our like increasingly pricey housing market and help address that pain. That policy is debated. People in different places think it works, think it's great. The construction industry in general tends not to like it. Most people there consider it government overreach or kind of heavy-handed. There's an argument that it gets wonky, but the argument is that maybe it's not the right way to address it. People disagree. That's what's important here. And anyway, Bozeman adopted that policy a few years ago. And then this year at the legislature, the Republicans were persuaded that that's not a good policy for local governments to have. And so they passed a law that says, hey, Montana local governments, you can't do that anymore. That passed, governor signed it. And so that policy, as I understand it, in Whitefish and Bozeman is now off the books or voided essentially. That was more concise than I expected it to be, Paula.
No, it was very good. It's one of those issues that I feel like I understand it, and then I don't again, and then I hear it explained. I'm like, oh yeah, right. That's how I remember it being. But it's a tough one. It's a tough one, particularly here with us when in the affordable housing issues.
Yeah, it's like been one of the big things that Bozeman has tried to do to address like what is possibly the biggest issue facing the community. And people debated like, has it actually worked? Like I think like one of the stats, I haven't had a chance to check this with the city, but at the legislature, they were throwing around the stat that said it's maybe a couple dozen houses that have been produced in Bozeman over the last 2 or 3 years under that program. And I think the argument in the city was there are more in the works, just give us more time. Right. But still like compared to how much need for accessible housing there is in Bozeman, that's a drop in the bucket.
Exactly, which goes back to the economic issues that we were talking about and finding workers and being able to pay them.
It's all connected. That's why it's hard to explain.
Right. Well, you did a great job. So another question. Great to have Montana Free Press on our computers this morning. Wondering if, after the very busy legislative session, what special issues you look forward to covering in the coming month or months? You know, now that the crush is over, what are you guys looking forward to?
Well, I can probably take this one generally, and then the reporters who know what they're working on better than I do can follow up. Honestly, in large part, it's more session, it's wrap up, it's things like this. It's what bills sort of escaped the net that are impactful enough to go back and try and get a grip on what they did and what they're going to do. So you know, this 3-4 weeks after the close of the session, we're still doing a lot of policy work. We're still doing, and then starting to look forward to how are some of these bills going to be implemented. We were talking about surprises earlier. I know for the past 4 or 5 days, myself and several of the reporters have been sitting around going, what's going to happen with the adult use marijuana bill? Why has that not been signed yet? Is something weird happening? And then of course, it was signed yesterday without any particular amendment that I'm aware of. So how is that going to be implemented? Basically looking forward to and starting to schedule longer term stories over the course of months and years, because I mean, ultimately these policies are going to go out into the world and they're going to have the impact they were designed to have, or they were going to have impacts that they weren't designed to have, unintended consequences. So we want to be prepared to not just chop it off, sine die, session's over, that's what happened. How is it going to impact? How is it going to impact real people in real communities on the ground, on the receiving end of these policies? And of course, that's going to be playing out and generating data, generating evidence for years. So planning how to cover that. That said, we are looking forward to, I think, everybody really being able to turn back to sort of their core beats, and I'll let each of the reporters speak to that. You know, we brought on Alex and said, for instance, okay, you're our education beat reporter. Also, here's this unprecedented legislative session where, you know, sorry, buddy, but I happen to know that you have some awareness and expertise outside of education, so we're going to drop all this other stuff on you. So I think all the reporters are really eager to get back to their core beats and really start developing those. And I'll let the reporters talk about what they're looking forward to on that, in that regard. First come, first serve.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, so I can dive in. I mean, there are a raft of changes in healthcare and in education that I'm looking forward to tracking how these new policies work out on the ground. But the big question that's facing education, or one of the big questions that's facing education post-session now, is with this 500 million plus in COVID federal relief funding going to schools. A big chunk of that is going to be addressing budget issues that schools face due to fluctuating enrollment as students who may have dropped out of school or gone to homeschool during the pandemic start coming back. But a chunk of that is also geared towards addressing learning loss as a result of the pandemic. And a lot of people I've talked to in the education community are really kind of trying to wrap their heads around, how do we define that learning loss? How do we figure out what kids lost out on, what areas students need to like focus on or get help catching up on? You know, standardized testing, a lot of folks have said, is not going to be a metric for gauging learning loss as a result of the pandemic. And in order to steer this federal relief money, the Office of Public Instruction has to start over the course of the summer, and the Board of Public Education too, defining what that learning loss is. And so that's going to be a conversation that is going to carry over into the fall semester. And I'm really going to be interested to see how the state defines learning loss and how that money starts to get directed towards those students who suffered from the pandemic. So.
And then Eric, of course, is going to be tracking there's a lot of stimulus money to track, and there's going to be for a while. Eric, you mentioned earlier, Paula, the Longstreet's reporting project, which is a specifically economic and largely rural economic development reporting project that we produced with the help of the Greater Montana Foundation. And that project's been going on for a couple of years, but I know Eric has ambitions after this pent up in the basement, or pent up somewhere, including in the basement year, to get out on the road and spend a lot of reporting time outside of Helena, developing stories on the economic front.
Yeah, I'm interested in kind of understanding how COVID has changed Montana's economy. What portions of that change are permanent? There are all sorts of anecdotes floating around about people moving in because they can do more remote work now. I'm curious, I hear a lot about that in Bozeman and Helena, Missoula. Curious whether that's happening in other parts of the state as well. Would like to find some numbers that can actually pin that down, because we hear a lot about that from realtors, but I've not seen hard data yet that can specify how big that trend is. Also really interested in how cost of living issues are impacting people, things like housing and childcare, and I think those are probably the big ones, but just how does that affect our ability to live the lives we want to live here in Montana, in different parts of Montana? So we have story ideas there. Ping me, please. I would love to chat.
And I just got notification that Amanda has got a conflict and needs to jump off in a minute. So I'm going to ping this question over to her real quick before she has to go.
Sure. Yeah, I'm really interested in the future of energy generation in Montana. So Northwestern Energy has recently released their plan, or what they're going to apply to the PSC to acquire new energy generation resources. So I'm really interested to see what that mix is going to look like and what proposals didn't meet the threshold that they were interested in. And I'm also interested in Biden's Civilian Climate Corps program. Montana has a pretty active CCC sort of situation going, and I am really interested to see what that will look like as it rolls out in the coming months. Thanks for all of the great questions, everyone. The library is such an awesome resource here in town. I love our library.
Yay.
And with that, I've got to go.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for joining
Amanda.
us. Thanks for popping her over, Brad.
And then I know Mara is developing a more focused beat in social services broadly defined, and also would like you to mention maybe that we're starting to strategize about a season 2 potentially of Shared State, which is a podcast collaboration that we did prior to the election with Yellowstone Public Radio and Montana Public Radio. So several irons in the fire there that maybe you could talk about a bit.
Yeah, the Shared State collaboration was really fun and interesting for our newsrooms, and a good challenge for our collective newsrooms to kind of look at some of the political moment that Montana is in and try to tell some stories around that involve historical context and contemporary voices and issues. So we're looking to try to, I guess like revamp a little bit and see how are we understanding Montana's political moment right now? What are some of the defining issues or the defining topics, and how are those affecting people across the state of Montana? So we're doing a lot of brainstorming around that right now, and we'll hopefully have a robust season of episodes to deliver in a couple of months. And then personally, I'll definitely be continuing to look at social services a lot, mostly to do with substance use disorders, treatment, prevention, mental health treatment in the state, and a lot of efforts to kind of expand and diversify some of those social safety options for people who sometimes fall through the cracks, so to speak. So that will be the next couple of months for me, definitely.
Great, thanks. I actually, my question was going to be, is there going to be another podcast? I really enjoyed that. I have shared it with many people, and I don't know if Brad, you've noticed, or others, that I have on my signature line, I say what I'm currently reading, what I'm listening to, and what my current favorite podcast is. And Shared State was that this summer. So thank you very much for that. And I
Thank you.
for the next
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, so we're gonna have to wrap up real quick, but, and I'm gonna, Brad, I've got a question for you, and then I'm gonna ask Eric, Mara, and Alex why your book recommendations. So you can think about that while Brad, my question is, you talked a little bit about the state of journalism in Montana, but what do you think about the state of journalism in general? And, you know, as a nonprofit news source now, and do you guys have any thoughts about getting a reporter in DC?
Well, there's not a lot to sink my teeth into there, is there?
And you have 30 seconds.
Do we, let me start with the easy one. Do we think about getting a reporter in DC? Absolutely. Are we near to that being a reality? I don't believe we are. But we're certainly aware of the need. Yeah, we're very aware of the need. It's a conversation that we're having. How could we do that? Whether that means partnering with, I don't know, another nonprofit news organization in the region, like maybe High Country News or Wyofile in Wyoming, just for examples. It's it comes down to expense, obviously. It is, we're now in a world where I think the idea of remote offices and not everybody necessarily being in the same place is pretty comfortable. You know, so the idea of having somebody based in DC to cover the Montana federal delegation is a great one. Hiring a professional reporter to live in the DC market is an expensive proposition. So I suspect that if and when we get there, that also is going to be some sort of collaborative project with other nonprofit news organizations. What do I think about the state of journalism generally? I think it's exciting as it's ever been. Having been through some relatively, I'm old, so I've been through some pretty moribund eras, but I think that right now, you know, 200 years worth of business model is crumbling around our ears in journalism, which is causing a lot of pain in the industry, and you hear about that pain pretty frequently, and you know, we see it in our friends and neighbors who work for the traditional daily newspapers in our communities. Given that pain and that crumble, though, I think it's the flip side of that is that it has turned out to be a period in which a lot of really smart people are expending a lot of focused effort and thought on how to reinvent it. So there's a lot of competition in the space. There's a lot of innovation in the space. There's a lot of people trying to figure out, given that this is not working well, this thing we've been doing is not working well. There's a lot of smart people really putting dedicated thought into what would work well. We certainly consider ourselves to be part of that larger question, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we are trying to be part of the solution to create a media landscape here in Montana where reporters can make a professional living. If you want reporters to do professional work, you need to allow them to make a professional living. Allow, that was the wrong word. You need to give them an opportunity to make a professional living and not just spend 2 or 3 years at a daily paper and then realize that you can't afford to be an adult on that salary and move somewhere else. People talk a lot about institutional knowledge and the institutional knowledge that's lost when veteran reporters retire or get laid off. But you got to build up that institutional knowledge from the front end. And I know we and some other organizations are dedicated to finding a way to make that work. I just also think it's really interesting that, you know, the funding model, we talked about nonprofit, obviously, when we're talking about journalistic innovations, we're mostly talking about nonprofit at this point. And everybody's still trying to figure out how that works, what kind of audience is required to make that work. Obviously, a big piece of the puzzle is donor support. So we're, you know, getting into the kind of space that public radio has long been in. it remains to be seen how that will pan out over the long term. I mean, I think I think there's a risk of people being asked to pay for things that they're not used to paying for, and what is the cap on that? But at the same time, when you're moving from a traditional newspaper model of advertising pays the bills to readers pay the bills, I think there's a lot of advantages there. And if we can, if we can demonstrate those advantages, you're sort of taking out the middleman. It makes journalism a more direct, consumer-oriented product. You, as a reader, are paying for the reporting that you decided has value. So the connection between producer and consumer is a little more direct and a little more concise in the nonprofit model. And we're all trying to learn how to provide value as a journalistic organization that readers value enough to support. It's all new. There's a lot of people rushing into the space trying to figure it out. Not everybody will survive. I like our odds. I think we've hired the best team in Montana, and I'm allowed to say that. I can be proud, right?
Sure you are. Sure.
I mean, those are my thoughts. It's I've been at a different place on that curve of being kind of depressed about the state of journalism and being excited about it. But I feel like we're in a really exciting spot trying to invent something that solves some of the problems of the older models and provide value to readers.
That is, that's really cool. And we always like to end on an up note so that it is inspiring instead of saying journalism is dead. They used to say libraries were dead too, and they're needed more than ever. So we're going to do a quick wrap up for each one of you, 30 seconds to talk about why. Eric, you chose Fulfillment, Alex McGillis's book. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been doing is I try to think about how can I cover economic opportunity dynamics in Montana effectively, is read the national reporting that's being done on those 10 topics. And Fulfillment is, I think, the best book I've read in the last 6 months that talks about, it looks at Amazon specifically, what its growth has meant for the Seattle area, for the Baltimore area where it opened a warehouse, talks to people that work for Amazon, just does a really good job of unpacking the implications of that business model, which we're going to see here in Montana too. Like we're going to lose a lot of our brick and mortar stores to Amazon competition before too long. So it's worth reading if you want to understand that stuff.
Thank you. And again, you can get these books at Country Bookshelf or at the library. So Mara, you chose The Prophet, and I can't remember the author's name. It's something junior at the moment, but why did you pick The Prophet?
Yeah, I think it's Prophets with an S, and in case anybody's going to look it up, but a really beautiful fiction book, beautifully written. I chose it because it was really outside of the normal zone of things that I read. It was fiction as opposed to nonfiction. It wasn't about an issue that I'm covering, kind of like the way that Eric put it. And I think I needed that after this legislative session. And one of the things I really enjoyed about it was that it travels across space and time and continents, and really introduces a lot of very complicated ideas about typical gender roles, which in our society, which was just really refreshing and a creative take to read.
Well, thanks for that. I read a lot of fiction. My husband reads nonfiction. He says, go read your little stories. And I say, no, fiction is what explains the nonfiction, that we can access it. So thank you for fiction. So Alex, yours was Preventing the Next Pandemic, which is not fiction.
It's a book of poetry, right?
Yeah, I wish. No, I mean, I became, vaccinology has been kind of a hobby coverage area of mine since my freelance days. And I've done some bigger stories on vaccine development and science. And in the midst of this hesitancy, we've been hearing a lot about vaccine diplomacy. And, this book is from a former US science envoy from the Obama administration who continued his work during the Trump administration, really taking a look at the forces that drive resurgence of vaccine preventable diseases, which include poverty, political instability, war, climate change. And so it's really a deep dive into a lot of the issues that drive, or a lot of the factors that drive these diseases, and then how you start to craft a message around, preventing those diseases and treating that at sort of a global scale. So.
Well, thank you. And those were all excellent book recommendations, as well as Amanda's, which was Tribe, Homecoming and Belonging by Sebastian Junger. So we've hit our time perfectly. Thank you guys all so much. Brad, thank you for managing all of this and for giving us access to your amazing reporters here. I have thoroughly enjoyed reading the paper. I still call it a paper.
We do too.
And, again, the podcast, and Eric, your podcast as well. So fabulous job. Everybody, please go to montanafreepress.org, and thank you to the Bozeman Public Library and the Bozeman Public Library Foundation for sponsoring our library community forums. And we will be back again in September. So this was a wonderful wrap up for us. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for joining us, to our participants.
Thank you all. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Good job. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.